In the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, a senior officer of the U.S. Air Force Space Command clutches a small metallic cube, scarcely larger than a Rubik's Cube. "If we lose this cube at in orbit," he explains, "it could be someone else's attack vehicle." In the past, satellite operators, like those controlling GPS satellites from Schriever Air Force Base down the road, would have blamed problems on space weather or communication glitches. Now their minds leap to hacking, jamming and deliberate collision. And so on August 29, President Donald Trump announced the creation of a new U.S. Space Command, with operational control of nearly all American space assets. He promised that a Space Force, the first new military service since the Air Force was established in 1947, would follow. The distinction between command and service is important. Since the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986, America's armed forces have been cleaved into two parts. Individual services train and equip their respective forces but do not send them into battle. Instead, 11 so-called combatant commands divvy the world up into 6 geographical chunks, and 5 functional areas such as cyber, special operations, and now space. The head of each one controls all the forces within his or her fief, whatever their service. Thus the admiral atop the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii rules over infantrymen in South Korea, Air Force pilots in Japan and Marines in Australia. This system was designed specifically to avoid the sorts of inter-service quarrels that contributed to a botched hostage rescue mission in Iran in 1980. For some years, space sat awkwardly in this structure. There was a dedicated Space Command between 1985 and 2002. But after the September 11 attacks, an emphasis on terrorism and homeland defense led to the creation of a new Northern Command, covering North America. Space was kicked into Strategic Command, whose primary job is nuclear weapons. There was some logic to this. Among America's most vital space assets are the satellites which look for signs of missile launches, detect nuclear detonations and pass orders from the president to nuclear forces. But as space threats seem to grow, China's test of an anti-satellite missile in 2007 was the first by any country since 1985. The arrangement looked problematic. In 2014, a review of space policy by the Obama administration concluded that it was critical that America be able to identify threats in space and counter others' anti-satellite weapons. The Trump administration intensified public warnings of those vulnerabilities. In February, General John Hyten, commander of Strategic Command, admitted that space was his third priority, after the modernization and control of nuclear forces. "It really is important to have someone who comes to work every day and that's all they think about: space operations, space threats and defending our space assets," says Matthew Donovan, the acting Secretary of the Air Force. That job now falls to General John J. Raymond and his team of 630 or so staff, projected to rise to 1,450, with a budget of $83.8 million. Notably, his command will have wartime control of the National Reconnaissance Office's fleet of highly classified spy satellites should they come under attack. Not everyone is convinced that the reorganization is urgently needed. In an essay published in July on War on the Rocks, a website, Brian Whedon, a former space operations officer with the Air Force now at the Secure World Foundation, a think tank, warned that General Raymond might clash with geographical area commanders. If, for instance, China jams American GPS signals during a war over Taiwan, Space Command and Indo-Pacific Command may disagree on how best to respond. The Pentagon is currently working out how such coordination will work. Mr. Whedon also worries that a dedicated command might encourage those fixated on future battles in space, satellite-on-satellite combat, rather than the more pressing task of using space assets to help commanders wage war on Earth, such as by sharpening GPS signals or redirecting spy satellites. Before Space Command can get stuck into cosmic battles, there is a more conventional war over federal dollars to be fought. Mr. Trump did not disclose which of 6 shortlisted bases across 3 states, Alabama, California and Colorado, would accommodate Space Command. For the time being it sits in Colorado, already home to many important space-related units. Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, which played host to German rocket scientists after the Second World War and now houses NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, is the dark horse. The debate is then likely to shift to Mr. Trump's Space Force, which, like the other services, would train and equip the space warfighters, as the Pentagon calls them, for General Raymond's command. White House has proposed a $500 million per year service that would sit demurely within the Air Force, much as the U.S. Marine Corps is a component of the Navy. Mr. Whedon says that this, not Space Command, ought to have been the priority. He points out that there is a pressing need to train more space experts. Over a third of space billets at Strategic Command are unfilled. Congress is broadly in favor of the force, although the Senate and House are haggling over details as they reconcile their respective versions of the National Defense Authorization Act for 2020. The Senate wants to put off creating a full-fledged service for at least a year, instead putting General Raymond in charge of both Space Command and a putative Space Force, to avoid bureaucratic bloat. The Democrat-controlled House prefers a less pugnacious label, Space Corps. Whatever it is called, the aim is to inculcate a galactic esprit de corps. When people join the Marines, it's not about joining the Navy, says Stephen Kita, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. Somebody joins the Marines and that's in their culture and DNA and ethos. And we're looking to create that for space. Let's block ads. Why?